Welcome back. And thank you to all those who have contributed to the Cough Drop Club. It is a we. I hope you had a good break and you had time to reflect and perhaps discuss a little bit some of the ideas we ran through this morning in our cosmic sweep from the Greeks through the Middle Ages, through the Newtonian universe, into the 20th and 21st century. That brings us to the question then, what is God? And who is God in this universe that is expanding in this biological life of evolution? So before I should maybe address this question, I would like to hear from you maybe some of your thoughts or questions from what we might have discussed this morning. Yes, so please let me open it up to you.
I've been reading you the last few years since Christ and Evolution, but putting it together with science from a layman's viewpoint, I've come to the conclusion that we don't need a Messiah, that it's not original sin, salvation. So if we don't have a God of Messiah, then putting it together with those last few thoughts of non-local particles and our actions and our thoughts affecting the whole universe, maybe we are our own Messiah.
That's an interesting insight. I think you could be onto something there, and I think we should take that that thought up when we talk about Christ and evolution, which we will continuing on in this journey. So stick with the program, okay? But that's a very interesting insight. Other questions or thoughts? Is there anything? Yes, please. In the back.
You had mentioned to think over the lunch about the question of what is God. So I put a few minutes into it. So what is God? And my background is a physicist, so from that I'm coming. Is essentially a mathematical equation, which is put it in words, but it's not well-defined equation, because two parts of it, what is and God. For that we have to do two kinds of actions. First we have to be able to say what is and perform that mathematical comparison. And then we have to have a database, we have to, in other words, know what God already is to be able to ask that question, what is God? So with all this, it becomes very interesting. What is God? Can we really ever know God? And if we are part of the God, then God is knowable and unknowable combined. But what does that mean? And how we can put it to use? Because our questions to answering this question, what is God, is to put this to a use, certain use. And what is that use, or if this is the right question to ask, and how best to ask it. So there's a lot to it, lots of dimensions. So,
wow, thank you. I didn't think of from a physics point of view on the question, what is God, but you certainly bring a lot into it. And I would just basically say this, like a good physicist, right, like a good scientist, the question itself is based on our experience. Whenever we have, a scientist will observe nature, and they'll ask the question, what is, or how is it? In the same way, I think we have the experience of nature that science alone cannot address. For example, what is it that gives beauty to a flower? What is the depth of this flower that radiates its beauty? What is truth? What do we mean? What is that truth? What is future? And these are questions that science alone cannot address, because these are questions that belong, you might say, to the depth of nature. So nature, we know, is not two-dimensional. Nature has a third dimension to it. And you might say the third dimension of nature, the dimension that has this sort of elusive nature of depth, the elusive nature of truth, the elusive nature of beauty. It's elusive because we perceive it, we apprehend it, and yet we can't grasp it. It grasps us, and that is God. God is not something we grasp. God is what we are grasped by. And so God is that depth, that beauty, that future, that which is at the ultimate horizon of meaning itself, beyond which we can't give meaning to, which keeps pulling us. And that is the beauty of the mystery of God, is that we are constantly trying to move toward this mystery, and yet the mystery has already, in a sense, is pulling us in. And it pulls us in ways sometimes that we're not conscious of this pull, but we feel it. You know, what drives a scientist? Why do we keep studying nature? Can't we just say this is enough? We know what it is. You know, we can operate on what we know. Why do we have to keep studying things? In the same way, why do we go back to nature to sit, you know, with the beauty of the trees and the flowers? What is it that keeps pulling us in a way that it's beyond our intellectual self, in a way that we are pulled in a deep sense, and we long for that which we are grasped by. We long for beauty. We long for truth. We keep pursuing these things. We are not self-satisfied creatures. And what we're saying is God is that, as Paul Tillich said, that name of ultimate concern, ultimate depth, ultimate meaning, ultimate truth, ultimate life. Ultimate in the sense that it will always be the absolute pulling the relative onto something more absolute, more whole, more full. So I think what you say is very good, but I think absolutely that the equation of God maybe is given in the equation of love. You know, and love, in a sense, not as something that can be mathematically described, but as deep relationality. You know, that relationship that keeps pulling us along. And even as we sit here, you know, there's always something about us that is never completely satisfied. We are never completely, you know, we're just, okay, this is perfectly fine. You know, there's always an unease. There's always something there's a moreness to our everydayness. You know, and it's the question of the more that keeps driving us. And our question is, what is the more that we seek? And that's then for the question of God or everything that substitutes for God. So, you know, when we come to this question, who will give evolution its own God, we're asking the question of gravity in, you might say, in the metaphysical sense. What is the lure, the pull of this whole cosmos towards something more whole, more unified? Are there any other questions or concerns or, yes?
You spoke briefly of centering prayer and then of prayer more generally, and I'd like to hear more about how you conceive of prayer, whether you think of it as primarily one-dimensional or reciprocal, and what kind of impact you sense prayer is intended to have, and prayer, when it works, does have.
Mm-hmm. So the question of prayer, I can say very, very quickly that I don't think prayer is about saying prayers. I think prayer is what the Ulanovs called primary speech. There's something, and I think that's something deep within our own nature, that there's an other at the heart of the I, you know, that there's something of this divinity, this mystery of absolute wholeness already within us, the otherness of the meanness, so to speak. And therefore that other that's within me and also beyond me is that deep relational dimension of myself. In other words, the very source of my life is at the heart of my life, and that is, in a sense, that source and heart of my life draws me into relationship, and prayer, in a sense, attending to that primary relationship within. that then, leads me to a deep awareness that what is within me is also at the heart of all life around me. So I do think prayer is that deep dialogue of mindfulness, deepened by love, that then I think in its own way, as we enter into, like any relationship, right? As you enter into that relationship, your awareness shifts, it changes, it grows. And that's why a relationship that is alive is a relationship of constant genesis. We're being born in that relationship over and over again. And therefore, I think prayer, it deepens within us, as that primary speech deepens, that God, who is at the heart of my life, becomes so much a part of me that in a sense, I am never alone, but I am always in solitude. In a sense that I am always, an awareness that whatever happens, whether the world, is annihilated tomorrow, that there is an other already that's part of me and within me. And that if I entrust myself to that other, that, as Julian of Norwich said, all shall be well and will be well in the up ahead. And therefore, I think prayer, in its deepest root, leads us out of partial selves into fuller selves. It leads us from being maybe left brain to being a full brain. It leads us to one dimension of reality to a holographic reality, where I can begin then to see my past, present, and the future in this, you might say, in this mystery of God that's at the heart of my life. So in my view, prayer is perhaps the most essential relationship to all other relationships of our lives. I think without that deep dialogue of primal relationality with divinity at the heart of our life, all other relationships are somewhat not stifled, but they never reach their fullness because we never really fully see. And this is what I think, what prayer does. It opens our minds and our hearts to see in a new way. So I think the discipline of prayer is because we are works in progress, right? We are partial selves being created. And I think prayer is part of that creation of ourselves. That we're not just over and done finished products, and now I'm going to pray that God makes it all good. Rather, that prayer is part of that creative process of self and other, as the world itself is being created in and through my life. I don't know if that really addresses your question, but it's how I might, give a few... Huh? It's fundamental. There we are. But it's again a very good question. Yes, one more question.
Well, Thomas Merton once put it that we are God wandering as a pilgrim in his own creation. And I think that our business is to discover the God who made a home in us. And then when we look at a flower, it's God looking back at his own creation and saying, boy, you really are a great flower. And that yearning back and forth, that, as you put it in your book, the systole and diastole of that relationship.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reminding me of Merton. I was thinking of another writer, Simone Weil, the French philosopher, who once said, "Whoever says I lies." And that's the Mertonian notion that God is, the self, that of myself is the God in myself. So that my praying to God is God praying in me. God praying to God, so to speak. Or the voice, that's calling out in me is God calling out in me to God. So that idea, pray for your own discovery. Pray to know that dazzling light already deep within us, Other questions? Yes. Over here in the blue.
To answer that question, it seems obvious that there's going to be a God added.
God added or edit?
Added.
Added.
who will give evolution its own God as opposed to somebody else's God. And in my mind, the language of the Bible is kind of a ball and chain to that expanding concept of God. Not all of it, but the language that is not a ball and chain is so subtle that most don't see it or hear it, because the other, all the personal pronouns and names are so upfront. It seems almost
Yes.
too big to get over.
Yeah.
What is your thought on that?
My thought is I'd like to tell you about Teilhard and what he thought about this, because I think as we ask these questions, we're a little bit too anthropocentric. And I would like us to expand all that we're asking here into the dimensions of the cosmos itself. We don't think in cosmic terms because we have not shifted our awareness to being part of this larger whole. But I think that's the missing piece here. And as long as we keep constraining the question of prayer or God to us, we're missing the bigger picture here. And that's why we can wind up with sort of anthropomorphized notions of God, even in terms of maleness or, the paternal type of God. We're missing out on divinity as absolute mystery at the heart of cosmic life, which includes our life. So maybe let's go with Teilhard and see how he might address this question: who will give evolution its own God? Now, why do I say this? Is because what he says today is this. He says, the world today has not grown cold, but it is ardently searching for a God proportionate to the newly discovered immensities of a universe whose aspect exceeds the present compass of our power of worship. Now, that's a mouthful, because what he's saying is, and it's true, if you look at the nuns, that's the Nones, which is the fastest rising spirituality today, 96% of the nuns believe in some type of God or ultimate being or absolute oneness, and very, very few are truly atheistic. But the God of the traditional religions, in other words, the institutional God, has become too small, too narrow for the immensity now of the universe we find ourselves in, and our power of worship does not do justice, Teilhard said, to this immense God. So, people are not so much a religion. I don't find there's anger to religious. There's more like they're just, in a sense, apathetic to the institutional religion. It doesn't connect. It doesn't compute anymore. And that is absolutely, I think, someone, who is alive in today's world. Now, what Teilhard said, and here's where I want to just kind of take this a little bit more slowly, because the old God, if I can speak in those terms, the old God was based on an understanding of being, a philosophy of being that was static and fixed. Aristotle's type notion of being. But what Teilhard recognized is that this evolutionary universe, grounded as it is in energy, is not so much static being, but there's an openness toward more being. And so he coins the term hyperphysics. Physics meaning the birthing of nature. That's really what physis means in Greek, birthing. And so nature is constantly birthing toward more nature. And translate that, life constantly seeks more life. And so he says there's a ground to being, sustaining existence, not so much from beneath, but from up ahead. And so what Teilhard says is that the principle of life in an evolving universe is future. Now, Christian faith is really about future. We have made it all about the past. To people, Adam and Eve, what happened 2,000 years ago. But the Gospels themselves are all about new creation and future. And so what Teilhard adds to that is not just the future of the humans, it's the future of the universe. The whole is open to the future. So what Teilhard says is the whole cosmos must be set in the glow that suffuses everything here in the dawn of an expected new day. That is the heart of Christianity. And he says, our personal hopes find satisfaction only in company with the fulfillment of all things. It's the Pauline notion. Paul in the letter of Romans, all of creation groans aloud in its desire for new birth. The Spirit is groaning. God is groaning aloud as this whole thing is seeking new birth. And so what I think Teilhard recognized, he said, this whole that keeps longing for more wholeness cannot be explained by materiality itself. In other words, science looks at the structures, but there's something about the structures themselves that cannot be explained by the structures. In other words, you can't explain something by its own self. In other words, there's something other that gives meaning to the whole. And so he realized that what gives coherence to the whole is not in the whole itself, it's something that is more than the whole, which Teilhard calls the future. And what he does is, he, in a sense, redefines the primacy of spirit as the primacy of the future. In other words, the future is not something that just simply belongs to God. It is the very essence of God. God is the future. And so what we are saying and what Teilhard begins to recognize is that the future becomes incarnate. The future is already in the now. But even prayer, even contemplation, although so many speak about the present moment, I think what Teilhard is inviting us to is a presence of moment that is already open to future. And our emphasis, I think, needs to shift from present to future. God is the future, and God is coming to us as the future from the future, so that what gives meaning to life is the very openness of life to more life. And that's a shift in understanding, how we conceive of God, not working mechanically or from behind. We have thought of God so much as this kind of past creator, that simply puts everything in place. And we're saying, no, God is not that past creator. God is that absolute future. And so that's exactly what he says. We've thought of God too much from the past, and we are now being invited to think of God drawing the world from up ahead, from attracting it towards something new. And by future, because we think in terms of linear time, we think of tomorrow, but I think of future as the realm of infinite possibilities. That's what we're saying. God is the realm of infinite possibilities. And so we are always, in a sense, living in that realm of infinite possibilities of every moment. And what does Deuteronomy say to us? Choose life. right? I set before you life and death. I set before you particles and waves. Choose life. And so Teilhard calls this principle of wholeness, the absolute whole, already embedded in this emerging wholeness, he calls this omega. Omega, you might say, is the sum of all light, all particles, all loves in an absolute fullness, an absolute wholeness. In other words, I think of this universe or this life in God like an onion. It's already, that which we seek is already within us. We have it. That's why prayer and the transcendence, we're constantly being pulled by it. That future fullness of life, the seeds of that are already in us. But they are not realized because God doesn't do it for us, right? We are being invited to choose life. We create the life. And so what this fullness actually materializes as is, in a sense, up to us. So God empowers the world to become something new without forcing the world to say what that newness will be. And so here's the beauty. God, as the future, pulls us constantly into future. And as we move toward future, the horizon of absolute future recedes. God is always the humility of love, the humble God, a God who will not get in the way of our future becoming. So that absolute future that is already in our midst is hidden, humble, poor, kenotic, self-emptied. And now that is, in a sense, sometimes our angst, our anxiety. We sort of know it deep within us, but we don't know where to go or what to do. And that's why dialogue, prayer, is essential to how the future fullness unfolds. So what Teilhard said is the universe rests on the future as its sole support. And if I were to invite us to make one shift, what if we were to stop thinking in terms of present and to think in terms of future? How might that change everything about us? How we think, how we relate, the choices we make for one another. And so basically I think what Teilhard holds out to us here is, we know classical theism, where we have God and creation. That world now belongs, in a sense, to past understanding of things. So we are, in a sense, in a world of process theism, where divine being and created being are, in a sense, entangled, or you might say sharing in the same level order of being. What Teilhard holds out to us is a panentheism. A God all in all things in God in all things, but God is God and not all things. And that is the mystery, that, we're God only all things, then all things God. In other words, divinity is materiality. Then, in a sense, there would be no real absolute future to pull us onto. It would be cyclic. And that is, in a sense, what material divinity is. It's cyclic nature. But we are on a trajectory of more nature. That's the difference. We're not cyclic. We're becoming something that is future-oriented, more complex, more consciousness, more being in love. And so this is maybe a different way to visualize the classical benevolent God, all my children, to an empowering God, a God of light, a God of love that is at the heart of all being, and a God who is so absolutely selfless in love, so hidden in love, that we can often mistake that God for something else. So Raymond Panikkar calls this kind of entanglement. And I think entanglement is a good word to just talk about divinity and created reality. And I might even conceive that from all eternity, we have been, you might say, waves, so to speak. You know, we have been wave particles in that mind of God, and God looked at us, you know, and we separated into a particular existence. But we constantly are sharing. Our waves are constantly interacting with divinity. But now we have our own particularity. And I think this, and there's something about divinity that wants us to choose. Absolute love is absolute freedom. God is absolute love, and therefore absolute freedom. And that means that God's love will never manipulate or control us. And sometimes I think that's exactly what we want. We want a God who will tell us exactly what to do and fix everything up. Right? And that's just not what love does. And you know that. That, you know, when you truly love someone, the last thing you want to do is manipulate that person or control that person. What love does, it wants the best for the other. And that's the type of God we have here. A God whose fate, as Karl Rahner said, is entwined with the fate of the world. And again, you know, we're pretty sure, like, really? Are you sure God's fate is entwined with the fate of the world? Yes. In other words, the God who is the absolute future is the God who empowers our life so that what we become, not just individually, but as universe, will impact what God becomes. And so we are saying that God is in the world together. We're in this process together, divinity and created reality. The world, we are continuously participating in God. God is constantly becoming God in and through the world. God is rising up in evolution. In other words, love entangled from the beginning rises up in consciousness to a point where we can begin to say the name God, you know, in a level of species we call Homo sapien. And therefore, this whole thing is constantly open toward more being and life, toward future. So what Teilhard says is only a God who is functionally and totally omega can satisfy us. The name of the game is future. This is the crux of religion itself for Teilhard. And so what is this wholeness of love, this wholeness of future? It is love itself, you know. And here's where I think for so long we've had this notion that God is love, that there's this mystery we call God, you know, big being, who loves. But I think what we are seeing is that love is God, just in the same way that future is God, because love is the realm of infinite possibilities. Where there is real love, you can never have the last word, right? Love is an open word itself. The whole of love speaks to an infinite horizon of being in love. So we're saying that a dynamic universe expresses a dynamic God who is love. And because love is personal, love is person to person, right? You cannot say, oh, I love everything, right? What is to love everything? You can only really love an other. This person, this tree, this leaf, this little creature, you know, because love is deeply center to center. And that's when I think the name God points to that absolute mystery of love, where divinity is constantly outward moving, other-centered, gift, vulnerable. The vulnerability of God, not the power of God. The power of God is the powerlessness of God, because that power now is given to us. Because this is a God who is humble. Or as Bonaventure said, God bends low to embrace us in our fragile human nature so that we might be where God is. God bending low. I mean, what parent, I'm looking here, what parent would not stretch forth their lives for their kids? If you truly love, you will give your life, for another. And that's the type of God we're talking about here. Deeply relational, deeply kenotic. And of course, the self-emptying of God is the very attractability of God. God's pouring out of God's self in love is that being drawn in love to God, so that there's this dynamism of expansion that's constantly going on. God giving God's self to us, that this absolute future of love at the heart of cosmic life, empowering this life, drawing everything into more complex relationship, into more higher consciousness. And therefore, there's a deep attractability at work here. We call this Trinity, but I think, Trinity has never... We know that, as Karl Rahner once said, we could dispense with the doctrine of the Trinity, and it wouldn't make an iota of a difference to how we think about the Christian God. Because we have no real kind of operative understanding that the name God points to deep divine relationality at the heart of life. And so Trinity is, you might say, the triadic structure of life. If science is telling us relationship is the name of the game, Trinity symbolizes the nature of that relationality. It is the type of not so much symmetry, but asymmetrical, insofar as that nature never rests in, might say, the balance of being, that there's a third dimension that's always asymmetrical and therefore pulling this onward toward more complex being. What we might call a threefoldness, that there's this union, and in this union there's a third, this bond between things is a third person itself, so to speak, and pulls the two into a new unity. And therefore, the whole of trinitization, what Taylor calls trinitization, or this kind of unfolding symbiotic unity, is future. That is, in a sense, life unfolding unto the fullness of life. So that we can say, in the beginning is relationship. Everything exists out of relationship. God is relationship. Love is relationship. And so what we are saying is a relational God empowers a relational universe. And I always love this slide, because this is a stained neuron, and this is a NASA image of the universe. And what we're saying is the deep intrinsic relationality of nature itself speaks to one who's at the heart of this relationship. So, it does then beg the question, what is this? What is this creative process? What is this absolute future, this wholeness at the heart of our lives, drawing us onward? God is creative, I think, because that's what love does. And I think all we have to do is reflect on our human lives to know that love, deep love, draws together in a deep union, and out of that deep union, new life is generated. Well, duh, I think God must be saying, well, of course. And so, creation is constantly expressing that divine love through the evolution of new life, which means that we might think of this universe as God's self-expressed, self-evolving nature. What if the universe is not about us and then God? What if this whole cosmic story is about God? It's God incarnating God's self, self-generating God's self through love, and rising up in consciousness in otherness, because that's what love does. Love expresses itself in the other. But I think we are so heavenly anthropomorphic. And we constantly see everything from our little two eyes, our little perspective. And that's why I think centering prayer and the deepening of consciousness can alter that reality and widen it to help us reframe it. Because what we begin to realize, and here's, again, I find that we are still, not you, because I know you're a very enlightened group, so here I'm just sort of preaching to the choir, but, to church at large, that the self of God is in the self-emptying of God. Now that's hard to get our heads around a little bit, right? But let's put it another way. We find our deepest selves when we give ourselves fully to another, right? And that's the same thing here. God becomes not God by becoming element to rise up as God. Are you with me there? So what we call this is anatheism, after God, or a post-theism. I do think classical theism must, in a sense, now give way to a new type of theism, in the sense that there's something other that keeps pulling us on into more being in life. So that what we are saying is God's not found opposed to matter or independent of matter, but through matter, which comes back to your question, right? Can we save ourselves? Now that's an interesting question because there is something of God already here. And it's I would say, a co-creative process, of what we are becoming if we seek wholeness. Because how do we find God? We find God in the finite. And that's exactly what we haven't preached. Oh, by the way, that we call that incarnation, in case we haven't thrown that term in there. I really think most of Christianity is clueless with regard to incarnation. We are either sort of quasi-dualists, if we're still on the Greek side of things, we're happy with dualism, or we're just happy to keep this juridical God, the God of law and judgment, far apart from us. But, the thing we call Christmas, the Word became flesh, that's exactly what we're talking about. God empties God's self into us, into otherness, into material reality. But, we love the baby in the manger thing, but do we really, really believe that this is God and God is like this? That God is not more powerful than this baby in the crib? God is not more knowing than this baby in the crib? That God can't do anything other than lie in that crib? And that just boggles our minds, right? Because we're pretty sure, well, that's just lovely, Silent Night, Holy Night. I love that song, But what we are saying is, behold, right? Look and see. What are you aware of? What are you conscious of? This God of absolute future has now entered into materiality and time and revealed to us the capacity, our capacity, to become something new. And so, as Teilhard says, we take hold of God in the finite, not some abstract spirituality or some trans-bodied existence. Right here in physical flesh, physical form, concrete reality. So, what we are saying is that this universe is unfinished and is becoming something. If God is at the heart of this universe, therefore, God is unfinished and becoming something. Which means that creation does new things, God does new things. And this reality, what we call the real, is dependent on one thing, and that is absolute future. So Meister Eckhart got this a long time ago, that great Dominican mystic, and he said, God is within in the head. And I want to just maybe underline, just in case we might go off track here. Divinity is divinity, right? So divinity is not materiality, and therefore not subject to the finite boundaries of materiality, which means God is the totality of God is within, and the totality of God is ahead. Transcendence and immanence. So what Meister Eckhart said is, God is the newest thing there is. The newest thing there is. When did you think of God as new? God is the youngest thing there is. We think of God as old, geriatric, grandfatherly. And what Meister Eckhart says is, God is the babe in the manger all the time, over and over again. And he says, when we are united to God, we become new again. Well, how about that? Religious people becoming new again. And you look around and you go, oh, really? Wow, it just seems so old sometimes. Because we're tied to old notions of God, old images of God. We have no sense that the name God is about future and future birth. To belong to God is to be born over and over and over again. But we have this thing like, I was born 60 years ago. Here, I'm just, I'm the last phase of my life type thing and just kind of waiting it out. And I am like, man, you have missed the boat big time, but you're great for Centrum Silver because they love you. So, what we are being invited to, religion, Christianity, in Teilhard's view, is about becoming something new. It's about future, and it's about birth. We can never be born enough, over and over again. And so, what he's saying is that the universe contributes something that is vitally necessary to God. Now that is, if you don't know this, you should know this. Teilhard's writings were never published in his lifetime. He was banned by the Jesuits and by the Pope, but you can see why, He saw from a different perspective. He saw from a higher plane. He's saying that creation contributes to God what God lacks in God's own divinity, namely materiality. And for centuries, we said that God cannot be affected by materiality. In fact, Thomas Aquinas would say material creation has no real relationship with God. And Teilhard turns that whole thing upside down and says, not only does it have something to say to God, it contributes to God's godliness. And so evolution, he says, is not just the universe coming to be, it is God coming to be. God becoming more God. In other words, can divinity become more divine? Yes, insofar as it is entangled with materiality. Insofar as that material becomes a unity in relation to divinity. And we might look at this as the lover and the beloved. The lover is constantly reaching out to the beloved and drawing the beloved in until the beloved and the lover are truly one, in that union of love. So, some very interesting questions and comments at the break, so thank you. Are there any questions that I might have missed at large? Is there anyone that has any? Yes. Oh, is there a microphone someplace there? There we go.
I was just wanting to talk about these words are symbols of meaning, and they only have meaning that we ascribe to them. And so if we don't define them and understand them, it doesn't really do anything. And what I'm interested in is, spirit, energy, consciousness. Those words almost seem interchangeable the
right.
way you're using them.
Yep.
And I wonder if you might say love is synonymous there, because if you start with the premises that the essence of the foundation of the ground of being of everything is consciousness, which you could also say spirit, let's use another word there, and then you would say that it's love, it's this relational attraction. So it seems to me that an answer to your question from earlier, then that is God.
Yes,
So
exactly. Right, so good. So it's true, language here is a little tricky because we have to use language that we've known, and yet these are new concepts in a sense that are emerging from what we know from science, from meditation, in other words, reflecting on nature now in light of Christianity or spirituality. So in some ways, the language can, and so using words is important. I think sometimes we have to invent new language, but that's, that might be on the side there. If you have nothing to do tomorrow, I'd encourage you to invent some new language here. But let's take the language of love and spirit, or the language of consciousness. I think you mentioned consciousness, love, spirit. These are almost interchangeable. It's almost like a double helix of meaning here. And the key, maybe the operative key, and this is how I think of things. If I were to visualize things, I think of this core energy, like a core energy field. And this core energy field has this, on one whole, a pole of attraction that, we might call love. Not just love as emotion, but love as that deep source of attraction. So what is it that keeps pulling me towards something? And there's something, is that me? Is that God within me? Is that God within me because God is in the other and God is pulling to God, as one thing. And then that pull of attraction, as I'm moving toward it, my consciousness is changing. In other words, my whole sense of self, my sense of where I'm going, my sense of longing begins to shift. And that's what I think, and is that spirit. So I do think that there's something here of love pulling, consciousness growing, and spirit is that vital life. And it's almost Trinitarian, almost that Trinitarian dynamic that, I'm pulled towards something, I'm expressing myself in that towards which I'm drawn to. And as I'm drawn to it, my consciousness shifts and my spirit is moving me in a new direction, in a direction that may be more free, more a greater understanding of self and other. And maybe I can say that as all of this is happening in this trinitization or triadic structure of unfolding being, that future is also, you might say, it's the arrival of the future over and over again. And I think that's that incarnating God is, the arrival of the future over and over again. That as I keep drawing towards something and beyond that, in that new complexity of relationship, I'm drawn beyond that future keeps pulling me onward. Where we get stuck is where, ego comes in, and therefore what I'm drawn to becomes more I over the thou, where I might fear what this union may bring us, and therefore I start to control, this relationality, and therefore we lose sight of future, and we get stuck in the present, and usually we kind of begin to grip onto the past, and by the time, and the more we let the ego take over, the more we find ourselves in this more isolated existence of I, now cut off from relationality, not conscious of, future, and now clinging to something that's no longer, and that's the past relics of whatever was. So I do think that that this unfolding triadic structure of spirit, love, and consciousness is the trinitization. That is God unfolding through our lives. But it's a work in progress, so we need to, this is why prayer again is, we pray into the mystery, and then we find the language that best expresses that experience of the mystery as it's beginning to take shape in our lives and our world. Yes, in the back and then over here. Right behind, yeah.
Yeah, in talking about this left brain dominance and such, and really kind of what you were just speaking towards as far as the inability of language and the brain. It seems to me the closer I get to God, the more it's in my body and my nervous system, and I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit more, because it just seems like it can't happen here.
Well, that's exactly, and welcome to the ancient, the ancient fathers. That's exactly what they would say. The great mystics of the Christian tradition would say, the closer we get to God, language falters. Pseudo Dionysius is the one, in a sense, who sort of systematized this. We have the cataphatic approach to spirituality, that which we can say, God is great, God is light, but God is more than light, and God is more than just great. God is super light and super great. So language falters. And of course, and the mystics will tell us that as we approach the divine, that mystery, the language that is best expressive of that relationship is silence. The wordless word, because that silence, that wordless word is then the full experience of love. And we know that, and we know this, the experience of love always supersedes our words. That we know more deeply by way of experience than by way of language. It's a fallacy of misplaced concreteness to think that our language can actually define our knowledge. And that's, again, I think that's left brain, I live in my left brain egoistic self to think that, hey, what I can tell you about God and religion and science, this is it. And it's like, really? Oh, come on. So it's, you want to be respectful of where people are on the journey, right? And then I have about 5 minutes of respect, and then I go, okay, move on. So we need to move to isn't the Gospels like this? Francis of Assisi, I think, he's being a Franciscan, he said, preach by way of example, use words when necessary. We don't have to talk about any of this. And it is about what we are drawn to, how we are conscious of one another, how we are conscious of belonging to a whole, and therefore how our actions, every action, whether it's how we smile, how we sneeze, how we say hello, how we say goodnight, all of that is expressive of our deep knowing of this presence of divinity at the heart of materiality. So maybe the best thing we could do is not to use so many words. We are inundated with words, by the way. We are so information driven that we are brain dead. There's so much coming across our poor little brains that the thought of silence just seems too much for us to handle. And so that's tomorrow's talk, by the way, on technology. Anyway, thank you for that input.